The light of the sun is dying, but not as fast as her hope. That is the truth, and Eira knows it as surely as she knows the bite of the shackles on her wrists. She has been held in the iron cold cells for 12 hours. 12 hours since the king's scouts caught her treading on forbidden frost of the royal glade. 12 hours since she was stripped of her nomadic tribe's safety. She has pleaded for mercy, for the chance to explain the star maps on her skin, for anything but the sword. But the obsidian-clad guards do not see a Star-Seer. They see a trespasser, a thief, a stain on the king's absolute order. So when the Iron Sovereign himself rides into the center of the execution courtyard, his war beast padding beside him like a nightmare given fur and bone, Eira does the only thing she can. She kneels, not out of respect, but because her legs can no longer hold her. "Please," she whispers, her moss-green eyes searching for a shred of humanity in the man above. "The stars guided me there. I meant no harm to your laws." The courtyard falls silent, the kind of silence that happens when a kingdom waits for the sound of blood hitting stone. Because the man she is addressing is King Malachir, the sovereign of Oakhaven, a man who has traded his heart for a crown of iron. Men who have conquered cities would not dare meet those steel-blue eyes. He looks down at her from his colossal black warhorse, his face a mask of weathered stone. Those eyes, sharp as a Roman blade, hold only the weight of his laws. Order is the only thing that keeps the frost at bay, Malachir says, his voice a flat, freezing wind. And trespassers are the cracks in that order. Vargrim, end her. That should be the end of it. Everyone expects the carnage. They expect the spray of red against the white snow, the predictable violence of a king's justice. Eira closes her eyes, bracing for the weight of 10-foot muscle and the snap of bone. She hears the sound, a low, rumbling vibration that shakes the very cobblestones. But there is no pain. The war beast has moved. That massive, scar-riddled creature, bound to Malachir's bloodline by ancient, burning runes, has moved with a speed that defies his shackles. He has not lunged for her throat. Instead, he has planted his massive forepaws on either side of her trembling frame. The entire courtyard stops breathing. Vargrim, the beast of war, does not bite. He lowers his head, the head that has crushed the skulls of giants, and presses his cold, wet muzzle into Eira's palms. He exhales a long, warm breath, sinking his massive chest into the slush until he is kneeling before her. Now the entire kingdom is wondering the same thing. Why would the king's most loyal monster defy a direct command for a girl he was just ordered to tear apart? Eira stares at the glowing amber eyes of the beast. The beast stares back with a human-like sorrow. She had heard the legends of the war beast. Shadows made of muscle and teeth that only knew the king's hand. This one was a god of war, draped in heavy iron and scars. And he stood over her like a guardian who had finally found his home. Vargrim. The king's voice cracks across the stone like a whip. Kill her. The beast does not move. Malachir dismounted, the heavy thud of his black iron boots against the cobblestones sounding like a funeral knell. He didn't look at the girl. He looked at Vargrim, his gaze fixed on the glowing runic brand that pulsed with a dull, angry heat upon the creature's shoulder. The wolf's amber eyes remained locked on Eira, a low, protective hum vibrating through his massive chest. The king's guards moved forward, pikes leveled, but the beast's lip curled, revealing a yellowish canine tooth that had tasted the blood of empires. "Stay back," Malachir commanded, his voice a low rasp. He could feel the phantom burn of the runes on his own chest, a sympathetic sting that told him his bond with the creature was fraying. The execution was no longer possible. To strike the girl now was to risk the beast turning on the crown, an event that would leave Oakhaven defenseless against the encroaching frost. Malachir finally looked at Eira. She was pale, her espresso-brown hair matted with sleet, but her moss-green eyes didn't hold the hollow vacancy of the dying. They held a terrifying, quiet clarity. "Take her to the high tower," Malachir spat, turning his back to hide the tremble in his gauntlet hand. "Chain her to the stones if you must, but she is to remain alive. If she breathes, the beast breathes." The transition was a chaotic blur of iron and shadow. Eira was dragged toward the obsidian spire that pierced the gray sky, but the guards quickly realized the futility of their task. Vargrim would not be led away. The massive creature followed, his heavy shackles dragging across the stone with a rhythmic, haunting scrape. He paced beside Eira, his shoulder brushing against her slight frame, a gargoyle of fur and scar tissue that would not permit a single hand to touch her roughly. By nightfall, the high tower became a cage for two. Eira sat upon a bed of thin straw, the cold air whistling through the arrow slits. In the center of the room, Vargrim lay coiled like a sleeping mountain, his head resting near her feet. Malachor stood in the doorway, the midnight crimson of his mantle casting a long, blood-like shadow across the floor. He watched as a servant placed a tray of raw, red meat before the wolf. Vargrim didn't even sniff it. The beast merely looked at Eira, then back at the king, his amber eyes clouded with a stubborn, ancient grief. "He will starve," Malachor said, the silver filigree of his armor glinting in the torchlight. "And if he starves, my power over this realm withers. Tell me, Star-Seer, what spell did you cast?" Eira looked up, her gaze steady despite the calm terror that radiated from her. "I cast no spell, my king. I only showed him what you have forgotten." "And what is that?" "Mercy," she whispered. Malachor slammed the iron door shut, the sound echoing through the hollow tower. He retreated to his chambers, but as he pulled away his breastplate, he gasped. The eclipse crest on his chest was turning a bruised, violent purple. The girl was a contagion, and yet he was now her most desperate protector. The stone walls of the high tower did not just hold the cold. They seemed to breathe it. Eira sat in the oppressive silence, her back against the jagged obsidian blocks, watching the rise and fall of Vargrim's massive rib cage. The beast was weakening. He had refused the charred remains of the hunt and the water from the silver basins, his amber eyes growing dim, like embers smothered by ash. He was a creature designed for war, yet here he lay, choosing a slow, quiet death over a life of commanded slaughter. Driven by a pull she couldn't name, Eira reached out. Her hand trembled, the vine-like tattoos on her wrists pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light. As her fingers brushed the coarse, charcoal fur of the beast's shoulder, she felt the heat before she saw it. The runic brand, the slanted for that marked his servitude, wasn't just a scar. It was a weeping wound in the fabric of his soul. It glowed with a dull, suffocating crimson, smelling of burnt ozone and ancient sorrow. She didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against the brand. "Rest," she whispered, her moss-green eyes fluttering shut. "The Star-Seer burden. Let them carry a piece of it." The moment her skin met the rune, a violent jolt of energy surged through her. It wasn't the searing pain of fire, but profound, overwhelming ache. The collective memory of every life Vargrim had been forced to take. The gold flecks in her eyes flared as she channeled the star lore of her ancestors, offering a cool, silver calm to the beast's burning rage. Across the keep, in the suffocating opulence of the royal chambers, King Malachor collapsed against his mahogany desk. He gripped his throat, his breath hitching in a sudden, terrifying spasm. Since the branding of Vargrim years ago, his chest had felt like it was encased in permafrost, a numb, hollow void that allowed him to rule without the distraction of feeling. But now, a localized sun seemed to ignite beneath his ribs. It was a surge of warmth so sharp and sudden it felt like a blade. The ice around his heart didn't just melt, it shattered. For the first time in a decade, the Iron Sovereign felt the frantic, panic drumming of his own pulse. He felt the phantom sensation of a hand, small, soft, and impossibly kind, pressing against his soul. Tears, hot and stinging, blurred his steel-blue eyes before he could even comprehend the emotion behind them. Malachor tore open his tunic, staring at the eclipse crest on his chest. The bruised purple was fading, replaced by a faint, golden luminescence that mirrored the light in the high tower. He gasped, the air in the room suddenly tasting of wood smoke and hope instead of stagnant stone. In the tower, Vargrim let out a long, shuddering sigh and finally closed his eyes in a natural, peaceful sleep. Eira remained beside him, her hand still anchored to the scar, unaware that miles away, the king was finally beginning to wake up. The silence of the high tower was broken not by the wind, but by the rhythmic click of a staff against stone. Eira remained huddled beside Vargrim's sleeping form, her fingers still tracing the now-dulled rune on his shoulder, when a shadow elongated across the threshold. It belonged to High Priest Valerius, a man whose robes were the color of dried blood, and whose eyes held the predatory stillness of a snake. He did not look at the girl. He looked at the beast, his lip curling in a sneer of clinical disappointment. "A pathetic display," Valerius murmured, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. "To see the realm's greatest weapon reduced to a whimpering dog by a trespasser's touch." Malachor stood just behind him, his frame rigid, though the steel blue of his eyes flickered with a strange, new exhaustion. He looked like a man who had been jolted awake in the middle of a long, dark night. "He is resting, Valerius. For the first time in years, the beast is at peace." "Peace is a luxury of the dead, my king," the priest countered, stepping closer to the sleeping wolf. He raised his staff, the obsidian shard at its tip beginning to thrum with a sickly violet light. "This mercy is a sickness. The girl has contaminated the bond. If the beast does not hunt, your own strength will begin to wither. You feel it, don't you? The softening of your resolve." Eira held her breath, pressing herself into the shadows of the alcove, through the narrow gap between Vargrim's fur and the wall. She watched as Valerius leaned toward the king, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "The runes are failing because they are too gentle," Valerius lied, a cruel glint in his eyes. "We must reform the rite of the marrow. We must carve the sigils deeper, not just into the wolf's hide, but into his bone. Only through his agony can your vitality be restored. The beast is the vessel, Malachor, but he is also the parasite. He must suffer so that you may reign." Eira's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked down at the vine-like tattoos on her wrists, then back at the sleeping Vargrim. The priest wasn't just suggesting a ritual. He was describing a slaughter. She realized with a jolt of horror that the bond was a lie. The king wasn't controlling the beast. The priest was using the beast to drain the king, turning Malachor into a hollow shell that could only be filled with violence and Valerius's dark intent. "The girl is the key," Valerius continued, pointing a skeletal finger toward the shadows. "She has disrupted the flow. Let me take her to the lower sanctum. Once I have extracted the secret of her influence, we will use her blood to seal the new marks." Malachor's jaw tightened, his hand twitching toward the hilt of his sword. For a moment, the iron sovereign flickered in the torchlight, caught between the cold logic of his reign and the terrifying new warmth in his chest. Eira locked eyes with the king through the darkness, a silent plea for the life of the monster who had chosen her over his master. The heavy iron gates of the keep groaned open, exhaling a breath of winter as Malachor led the small procession into the skeletal woods. He sat high upon his black war-horse, his obsidian armor slick with mist, looking every bit the cold conqueror, but his eyes were restless. Behind him, Eira walked with her head bowed, her thin kirtle fluttering in the wind, while Vargrim prowled at her hip. The beast was no longer the frantic killer Malachor remembered. He moved with a silent, lethal grace, his molten amber eyes never straying far from the girl. "This is the test, Star-Seer," Malachor said, his voice cutting to the snapping of frozen twigs. "In these woods, there are no walls to cage him, no chains to hold him back. If he is truly yours, let us see if he still serves a crown when the blood begins to run." The forest grew dense, the light fading into a bruised violet. Malachor's horse suddenly skittered, its ears pinning back against its skull. From a canopy of ancient oaks, a shadow detached itself, not a beast, but a man clad in the gray steel of a rival house, his crossbow leveled with mechanical precision. "For the fallen!" the assassin cried, his fingers squeezing the trigger. The bolt hissed through the air, aimed directly for the gap in Malachor's gorget. The king, caught in the sudden shift of his horse, was a fraction too slow. "Vargrim now!" Eira's voice didn't scream. It commanded, a resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the very roots of the trees. The beast didn't hesitate. He launched his massive, 10-foot frame through the air, a blur of salt and pepper fur. He didn't intercept the bolt. He intercepted the assassin. The crossbow bolt clattered harmlessly against Malachor's shoulder pauldron as Vargrim's weight slammed into the tree line. There was a sickening crunch, a short-lived cry, and then a heavy, visceral silence. Malachor steadied his mount, his breath coming in ragged plumes of white. He looked toward the brush, expecting to see the beast gorging on the kill, lost of the bloodlust that Valerius always claimed was his only nature. Instead, Vargrim stepped back into the clearing. He stood over the crumpled body of the assassin, but his head was turned toward Eira. He waited. He didn't lick his chops or howl in triumph. He simply watched for her nod of approval. Only when she placed a trembling hand on his scarred muzzle did the tension leave the wolf's massive shoulders. Malachor stared at them, the girl and the monster, and felt a hollow ache in his chest. The beast had saved his life, but it hadn't been an act of service to a king. It had been an act of obedience to her. For the first time, Malachor realized that the power he had wielded for a decade was a shadow compared to the quiet bond standing before him. "He didn't kill for me," Malachor whispered, the realization tasting like iron. "He killed to protect the peace I gave him," Eira replied softly. "And that peace includes you, my king." The return to the fortress was a silent affair, the air heavy with the scent of pine and the unspoken shift in power. That evening, the wind howled to the arrow slits of the high tower, but the interior was bathed in the warm, flickering amber of a single hearth. Malachor had come alone, stripping away his midnight crimson mantle. He sat on a low stone bench, looking less like a sovereign and more like a man haunted by his own ghost. Eira sat cross-legged near Vargrim, whose massive head rested in her lap. She pushed back the corselet of her sleeves, revealing the blue-ink constellations that spiraled around her wrists and disappeared beneath her skin. "They are not just markings, my king," she said, her voice a soft ripple in the quiet. "In my tribe, we call them the Astracarta. They are maps of the soul. They show where the spirit is anchored to the world, and where it has been frayed by the darkness." Malachor watched the faint glow of the ink, his steel-blue eyes tracing the delicate vines. "And what do they see in me?" "I see a man whose map has been rewritten by a hand that was not his own," she replied. She stood and walked toward him, her movements cautious. "The warmth you felt when I touched Vargrim, it wasn't a coincidence. You are not just his master, Malachor, you are his twin in suffering." With a slow, hesitant motion, Malachor reached for the buckles of his obsidian breastplate. The heavy iron groaned as it was undone, hitting the floor with a dull thud. As he pulled back the fine linen of his tunic, Eira stifled a gasp. Beneath the flawless armor, the king's chest was a ruin of jagged, raised scar tissue. Black, ink-like veins branched out from a central mark, the same slanted runic symbol that burned on Vargrim's shoulder. These were not battle scars won in glory. They were parasitic channels, pulsing with a faint, sickly violet light that seemed to be drinking the very color from his skin. "Valerius told me it was the price of strength," Malachor whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice, "that the beast's vitality would flow into me through these marks. But the more Vargrim kills, the colder I become. I can feel the ice creeping up my throat. Eira, I can feel myself disappearing." Eira reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the blackened veins. She finally understood the high priest's design. The obsidian set wasn't worn to protect the king from his enemies. It was worn to hide the fact that he was being consumed from the inside out. He was a vessel for the beast's pain, and as long as the beast remained a monster, Malachor would remain a statue of iron. "You are not disappearing," she said, her moss-green eyes meeting his with fierce, sudden heat. "You are being stolen. But the stars do not forget the original map." The winter solstice ball was a sea of false smiles and glittering masks. But for Malachor, the room was a blur of shifting shadows. In his hand, a chalice of heavy gold felt like a leaden weight. High Priest Valerius stood at his periphery, his eyes fixed on the king with a hungry, expectant stillness. With a subtle nod from the priest, Malachor drained the wine, unaware that a concentrated dose of thornbloom extract, vile and blackened with runic soot, was already racing toward his heart. The reaction was instantaneous. The warmth Eira had sparked days prior was suddenly doused by a flood of liquid shadow. Malachor's vision fractured. The blackened veins on his chest erupted in searing, violet heat that burned through his tunic, visible even through the gaps in his ceremonial armor. He let out a sound that was no longer human, a guttural, metallic roar that shattered the crystal flutes of the nearby guests. This was a black rage, the final stage of the parasite's feast. Malachor's steel-blue eyes turned a void like ink, and his hand flew to the hilt of his sword, drawing the obsidian blade with a screech of killing intent. He saw only enemies. He saw only the need to spill blood to quiet the screaming in his marrow. The court fled in terror as the king swung blindly, his strength doubled by the dark magic, a wolf in a man's skin. Amidst the chaos, Eira pushed through the fleeing nobles. Vargrim was held back by the priest's guards at the hall's entrance, his howls of agony echoing Malachur's own. Eira didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't call for the guards. As Malachur turned his shadowed gaze upon her, his blade raised for a lethal strike, she did the one thing that had broken the cycle before. She knelt. She dropped to the cold marble floor, her espresso-brown hair falling like a veil over her face. She pressed her forehead to the ground, her palms upturned in the snow-white silk of her dress. It was a gesture of absolute, terrifying vulnerability. The same submission Vargrim had shown her in the courtyard. "Malachur," she whispered, her voice a soft anchor in the storm of his madness. "Look at the map. Remember the man who felt the sun." The obsidian blade stopped an inch from her neck. The air around them crackled with the dying sparks of the violet magic. Malachur's breath came in ragged, animalistic huffs, but as he looked down at the girl who refused to fear him, the blackness in his eyes flickered. He saw her small, willowy frame, the catalyst of the only mercy he had ever known. The sword clattered to the floor. Malachur fell to his knees before her, his forehead dropping onto her shoulder as the black rage receded into a hollow, trembling exhaustion. He was weeping, the tears carving clean tracks through the soot of the curse. Behind them, Valerius's face contorted into a mask of silent, murderous fury. The king was broken, but for the first time, he was also whole. The echoes of Malachur's sword hitting the marble floor had barely faded when the high priest's voice sliced through the stunned silence of the ballroom. "Seize them," Valerius bellowed, his face a mask of practiced horror as he gestured toward the king, who remained slumped and weeping against Eira's shoulder. "Can you not see? The Star-Seer's venom has rotted his mind. Our sovereign is no longer a man. He is a thrall to her witchcraft. The royal guard, confused and fueled by the primal fear of the black rage they had just witnessed, hesitated for only a heartbeat. Valerius stepped forward, his obsidian staff pulsing with a domineering violet light that seemed to command their very wills. He spared the girl and knelt like a beggar. "He is unfit for the crown of Oakhaven. In the name of the founding runes, I take stewardship of this realm until the king is purged of this madness." Iron gauntlets tore Eira away from Malachur. She cried out as she was dragged across the floor, her espresso-brown hair sweeping the spilled wine. Malachur reached for her, his hand trembling. But he was too weak, his life force drained by the thornbloom poison. He watched in a hollow daze as Valerius stood over him, the priest's shadow swallowing the king whole. "Throw the girl into the maw," Valerius commanded, his eyes gleaming with a triumphant, cold malice. "And the beast with her. If they are so fond of one another, they shall share the same darkness until the sun rises. Then we shall have a true execution, one that leaves no room for mercy." The maw was the deepest dungeon beneath the fortress, a place where the stones were slick with the moisture of the earth and the air tasted of ancient iron. Eira was shoved into a damp, lightless cell, the heavy grate slamming shut with finality that felt like the lid of a coffin. A moment later, a massive, heavy weight was forced into the adjoining pit. She heard the familiar, rhythmic scrape of shackles and a low, pained whine that vibrated through the stone floor. "Vargrim," she whispered, crawling toward the iron bars that separated their cells. A massive, war muzzle pressed against the cold metal. Vargrim was there, his breathing labored and his amber eyes dimmed by the magic Valerius had used to subdue him. In the suffocating dark, Eira reached through the bars and found the coarse fur of his neck. Outside, the bells of Oakhaven began to toll, not for a celebration, but for a transition of power. Valerius had what he wanted, a broken king and a beast in a cage. But as Eira felt the steady, stubborn beat of Vargrim's heart against her fingertips, she knew the priest had made one mistake. He had locked them together in the dark. And in the dark, the stars are at their brightest. The darkness of the maw was not empty. It was thick with the scent of ozone and the impending rot of a dying kingdom. Vargrim's low growl grew into a thunderous, bone-shaking vibration. He did not tug at his chains with animal desperation. He pulled with the calculated fury of a god being insulted. With a shriek of shearing metal, the iron bolts anchored in the bedrock gave way. The massive wolf lunged at the rusted gate of Eira's cell, his weight shattering the lock like brittle glass. "To the throne room!" Eira gasped, her voice raw. She scrambled onto Vargrim's back, her fingers burying into the charcoal fur of his mane. The beast moved like a shadow through the corridors, a silent hurricane of fur and teeth that left the high priest's sentry scattered like dry leaves. They burst into the royal solar, just as the first gray light of dawn touched the windows. Malachor was slumped in his chair, his skin the color of ash. The blackened veins of the parasite had reached his throat, pulsing with a terminal violet glow. Valyria stood over him, an obsidian dagger raised to finalize the sacrifice that would transfer the king's remaining soul into the priest's own staff. "Get away from him!" Eira screamed. Vargrim's roar sent Valyria stumbling back, but the priest laughed, a jagged, hollow sound. "You are too late, girl. The ink has taken root. To pull it out is to kill him." "Then I will not pull it," Eira whispered, sliding from Vargrim's back. "I will invite it." She knelt before the fading king, taking his cold, limp hands in hers. She ignored the priest and focused on the astrocarta upon her own wrists. The vine-like tattoos began to glow with searing, brilliant white, the light of 1,000 distant suns. She pressed her forehead against Malachor's, closing her eyes as she opened the gates of her own spirit. "I am the map," she chanted, the ancient tongue of the Star-Seers vibrating through the room. "I am the vessel. Give the darkness a new home." The effect was horrific. The black, runic ink beneath Malachor's skin began to liquefy, crawling like sentient leeches toward the point of contact. Eira's body convulsed as the poison entered her. The blackened veins raced up her arms, swallowing the star tattoos, turning her pale skin into a canvas of agony. Her breath hitched, her heart slowing as the parasitic curse began to drain her vitality to feed its hunger. Malachor's eyes snapped open, the steel-blue clarity returning as the violet rot receded from his throat. He saw Eira's face contorting, her moss-green eyes rolling back as the black ink reached her heart. She was dying for him, a king who would order her execution, while the beast let out a mournful, earth-shattering howl. The black veins reached Eira's throat, and for a heartbeat, the world went silent. Her small frame went limp, the brilliant white of her star tattoos swallowed by the parasitic ink. But as the curse finished its migration, it found no hollow shell to occupy. It met the astrocarta, a map of a soul that was not built on fear or iron, but on the boundless light of the stars. The ink began to smoke, hissing as it was purified by her inherent light, shattering into harmless ash that drifted away like gray snow. Malachor surged forward, catching her before she hit the floor. His hands, once cold as a winter grave, were burning with a terrifying, beautiful warmth. He looked down at his own chest. The eclipse crest was gone, leaving only smooth, pale skin. When he raised his head to face Valyria, the transformation was complete. His eyes were no longer the piercing, frozen steel of a sovereign. They were a deep, resonant blue, flickering with the gold of a man who had finally reclaimed his spirit. "Your reign of shadows is over, Valyria," Malachor said, his voice no longer a flat wind, but a resonant thunder. The high priest scrambled for his obsidian staff, but Vargrim was faster. With a single decisive snap of his massive jaws, the beast shattered the conduit of the parasite. Valyria let out a hollow cry as the stolen years of vitality he had drained from the king recoiled upon him, turning him to dust before he could even beg for the mercy he had never granted. Malachor turned back to Eira, cradling her head. Slowly, her moss-green eyes fluttered open, the flecks of gold within them glowing with a soft, renewed light. The black ink was gone, replaced by her tattoos, which now pulsed with gentle, rhythmic silver. She looked at the king and then at Vargrim, who rested his enormous muzzle against Malachor's shoulder. The three of them stood in the center of the solar, a king, a seer, and a beast, bound no longer by runes, but by the choice to protect. Malachor walked to the balcony, Eira at his side, and Vargrim padding silently behind. Below, the people of Oakhaven gathered in the courtyard, the same place where an execution had been ordered only days before. The era of the Iron Sovereign is dead. Malachor's voice carried across the frost, reaching every ear. From this day, we do not rule by the weight of our chains, but by the strength of our mercy. The Star-Seers shall be our guides, and the beast shall be our guardian, not our executioner. As he spoke, The sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a long, golden light over the obsidian spires of the keep. The frost began to melt, the first trickles of spring water singing against the stone. The iron had finally softened, and for the first time in a century, Oak Haven woke up to a dawn that did not feel like a threat.